welcome everyone to the latest Planning Live. It's really good to have you all here. And as I said before, it's great to have all of us in the same room for the first time today. So thank you for joining. We've got a really interesting topic today, talking about obviously the buzzword of NPF4. We have today obviously the three partners at Brodie. So Neil Collar, Elaine Farquharson-Black and Karen Hamilton. So we should hopefully have a really good discussion. As I said, please do ask questions when you can, and we'll either pick them up as we go through or at the end. As we've got 45 minutes, I'll get cracking. So this Planning Live is called NPF4 New Era. So could I ask the three speakers, why do you think it is a new era?
Well, if I can kick off on that, it's a new era, certainly in terms of development planning and how that's structured. And I suppose we've spent so much time recently looking at the new policy documents which are coming in the shape of NPF4, obviously, and I think it can be easy to forget about the documents that we're actually going to be losing. So, of course, SDPs are going, as we know, as is supplementary planning guidance, which formally has been part of the development plan. So I don't know how many people are necessarily shedding a tear about the loss of SDP. Elaine is one of them. I think it was a change that did have a lot of support in terms of the problems that the SDPs had in the past and the systems around those. But one thing it does leave us with is much more control over the system from Scottish Government. And of course, we're seeing that coming out through NPF4 and, in particular on the housing numbers, which has obviously been one of the key concerns in that area that people have been talking about. So I suppose you might say that's the structural side of things, but...
And Karen, sorry to interrupt, just to remind ourselves that we will be getting the regional spatial strategies, and
yep,
that's kind of got slightly forgotten in the excitement with the NPF, and it is a bit of an unknown what we're actually going to see there. So this is not the end of the excitement. There's more excitement to come.
There's always more excitement to come in planning, but I think that's right. The job of work that Scottish Government has had to do, it's been, there are so many things on the list, and obviously that is one of them where I think further guidance will be coming forward on the regional spatial strategies down the line. But going back to the new era, in terms of the policy context, of course, I suppose that's the thing that we've been focusing a lot on of late. And we now have the climate change agenda that's running very much through the heart of NPF4. And when the planning minister joined us just last week on Planning Live, he himself was acknowledging that as being a sea change in the way that planning would operate. So there's been a lot of head scratching around Policy 1. In particular, within NPF4, which of course is the climate change policy. And we know that the question of weight in planning is normally a matter for the decision maker, but of course Policy 1 tries to direct that significant weight should be given in all decisions in planning or all plan matters. Significant weight should be given to the matter of the climate change emergency. So there's little direction in NPF4 as to how that will actually work itself through, other than mention that really it's there to ensure that the climate change emergency is recognised as a priority in all plans and decisions. But is it really going to be relevant to all decisions that will be crossing planners' desks? I wonder if that's the case. And then, of course, we come back to the point, well, it's policy at the end of the day, so it may or may not be applied in every case, I guess, regardless of that intention.
Was that point, isn't it? That the interpretation of a policy is a legal matter, but the weight to be attached to the policy is, as you say, kind of for the decision maker. I'm struggling, I must confess, with Policy 1. How do I, as an applicant or an appellant, demonstrate that I am compliant, with Policy 1, because it is so general? if it's about demonstrating, that I'm not increasing the flood risk, that if I'm not impacting on water supply, I'm not having a detrimental impact on the kind of landscape, all those things that we're used to doing and assessing in planning applications, especially, EIAs, major applications, then that's fine. That's just kind of underlining what we do already, or bringing it to the fore. Or is it introducing new tests? And that's, I think, the concern at the moment, until we start to see this kind of being worked through in terms of both LDPs and kind of planning applications. What does it actually mean? And then your point, as you say, Karen, it's got to be considered as a whole anyway. And, in all balancing, one policy may carry more weight than the other. There's always this kind of tensions. I think one of the concerns that I have as well is that move from, as you said, from all the emphasis on economic or greater emphasis on economic growth to sustainable. I'm old enough that we've got MPPG1, which had that presumption in favour of development. And you used to recite that when you were, in your closing submissions and all of that. And then we became sustainable economic development. And now, we seem to have dropped the economic and dropped the development almost. And that it's just this in favour of everything being sustainable. And it almost feels to me as if it's gone too far in the opposite direction.
Yeah. Because quite an interesting example around that theme is the debate about embodied carbon and whether developers should be allowed to demolish buildings. There's a very high profile case in London at the moment, proposal by Marks and Spencer's in Oxford Street. So it'll be very interesting to see where that goes. It's come up in part in the consultation about redevelopment of Buchanan Galleries complex in Glasgow, and also just to show how it potentially affects all sectors. There's a campaign at the moment to save Wynford high-rise flats in Glasgow, where the Housing Association are proposing demolition. I think that's a slightly awkward example because they don't need planning permission to demolish. So it sounds as though they're maybe going to go ahead and demolish anyway. But the example of embodied carbon is a good example of, well, on the one hand, for Buchanan Galleries or whatever, does economic development justify moving forward, taking away what we've got? I don't know if they're proposing whole-scale demolition, partial demolition. It's consultation at the moment anyway. But it's very much, well, where is the emphasis going to land? And that's, well, on the one hand, we've got policy one, which says significant weight sustainability in effect. But on the other hand, as Karen was reminding us, NPF4 is just policy. And ultimately, it's for the judgment of the decision maker. So lots of room for debate going forward.
And of course, there's quite a bit of chat at the beginning of NPF4 about the other documents that it links into. And of course, one of those being the other NPF, which is the National Performance Framework, with the National Outcomes for Scotland, which NPF4 is aimed at facilitating. And of course, one of those relates very much to sustainable economic development. And so we're not taking the economy out of the picture.
I suppose what I would hope for, and hope that the AMAs and that local authorities pick up and run, is that it's about development. As you say, it's still about development, but can we do it in a more sustainable way? So having the development at the big, still that's what we're aiming to achieve, but let's make sure we do it better. If we can put it in sort of that context, perhaps.
That's a great start. So let's have a look at where are, in your thoughts, the biggest changes to in NPF4. I think perhaps we start with you, Elaine, with house building. That's your topic.
How long have you got?
Yeah.
I can fill the rest of things. I've tried to keep it brief in terms of jotting down kind of some of the key points. So, major ones, no longer a requirement to maintain a 5-year effective land supply at all times. That's what we all you kind of work towards. The tilted balance, where there hasn't been a 5-year land supply or the LDPs are out of date, which has been used to support the unallocated sites coming forward, that will also go. And instead, what we're going to have is NPF4 sets out what we are now calling the mattlers, the minimum all tenure housing land requirement. And then LDPs take that And when they then have to identify a 10-year local housing land requirement and then allocate enough land, not just for those 10 years, but for identified areas post 10 years. So like the safeguarded land that we often have in LDPs, at the moment anyway, but they become more important. And what they have to do is they've got to set out a pipeline. So in those 10 years, we're going to have the housing land that's going to come forward in years 1 to 3, short term. We've got 4 to 6, the medium term, and then the long term, which is the 7 to 10. And when the land is not being delivered as programmed, then land can be brought forward from the longer term allocations or the safeguarded land. So again, still a plan-led system because you've identified where it's kind of got to go. There's going to be no opportunity to bring forward unallocated land other than under the scenarios that Policy 16F kind of set out. And interestingly, that includes where programming is going more quickly. So we're normally used to it, we're behind the game. We've only got 2 years land supply, so we go and look at other sites that are not identified. Now it's going to be where they're coming forward more quickly. You're going to be able to look at unallocated sites, but you're also going to need to have evidence of 2 years housing land audits to demonstrate, that it's picking up that speed. So that's kind of, I suppose, the kind of background, George, and then you've got the more detailed kind of assessments that when you're coming forward with a housing application, you're going to have your statement of community benefits, what you're going to, kind of be bringing. We've got the detailed design policies, 20-minute neighbourhoods, presumption in favour of brownfield land. And at the end of Policy 16, helpfully, and in fact, at the end of all the policies, they have that kind of cross-policy reference to kind of highlight what other policies, are going to be kind of picked up, and that's quite useful for the kind of cross-check.
Grand, that's great. We have had a few questions already, and one on the housing, so I'll pick it up now. NPF4 assumes that in all areas, an RSS and NPF4 compliant LDP are in place. Do you think that transitional arrangements will still allow the tilted balance to be a material factor in determining planning applications or appeals in areas with a housing land supply shortfall and a non-compliant plan, given the Richard Hen's Nest decision?
I think it's going to be difficult because your strategic requirements set out in the SDPs and they disappear. So you no longer have a requirement. Instead, you're going to have a matler. So you've got and then yes, we've still got the local local land requirement to be identified. The matlers were updated to reflect the most up-to-date HONDAS, housing need and demand assessments that were in place. So some of them are pretty up-to-date in terms of the numbers. I've just been looking at Angus. Angus is based on the most up-to-date position. And some of them, they aren't. And then again, also you have to kind of see how Angus safeguards land actually kind of going forward as well. So you could see that the NPF4 and what it's thinking about can actually sit quite nicely with that plan still. You're still going to have to look at the housing land and the housing land supply, but I'm not sure that the tilted balance will operate in the kind of same way as it's swung everything. Would that be fair?
It's all speculation at this stage. That's where it's all fun. I think, as the question alludes to, it would be logical for the transitional guidance to say, well, let's just keep doing it the way we've been doing it until we're ready to do it the better way, i.e. the NPF4 way. But I hear what Elaine's saying, that even on a transitional basis, it's quite awkward because some of the bits of the jigsaw have disappeared. But again, going back to the background to the question, until you have the new LDP in place, or at least fairly far advanced, you're still missing a big bit of the jigsaw. It's an even bigger bit, actually.
But that's not going to be for another 4 years.
Well, exactly,
and to me, you can't have a transitional position for 4 years until that comes. We kind of start afresh. And yes, it would be a material consideration, but again, thrown in the mix.
Yep, Grant, that's really good. So from housing now, Neil, what's your thoughts on the changes for renewables?
It's quite revolutionary, but in a very positive way for renewables development. And that goes back to Policy 1, as we were talking about, that if you want to take Policy 1 as the overall messaging of climate emergency, what we're going to do about it, when you go to the renewables policy, it's saying, well, renewables is a big answer. And why should we put obstacles in the way. So the change from the SPP is taking away a lot of those policy obstacles and hurdles. And what it's leaving us with is the only specific restriction on wind farms in particular is in national parks and national scenic areas. Even in wildland areas, that policy restriction has been lifted. So it's very much taking us to the situation where it's about, well, what are the impacts of your project? If you can demonstrate that all of the environmental impacts are within acceptable limits, then yes, you should get the permission, and we shouldn't be arguing about, well, the policy says this and the policy says that, and are you in an area of search or aren't you? Which, to be honest, a lot of those are distractions, because if your site-specific impacts are within acceptable limits, the rest doesn't actually really matter. And an interesting bit of messaging, it also says that significant landscape and visual impacts are to be expected for some forms of renewable energy, primarily onshore wind, because of the size of the turbines, 200 metres and above now. And it goes on and says, where the impacts are localised and or appropriate design mitigation has been applied, they will generally consider to be acceptable. So it's a clear message to local authorities. Don't take a restrictive approach. We, the Scottish Government, feel that renewable energy is important enough that we shouldn't be getting in the way of it. So that is quite revolutionary and very positive for the renewables industry, unlike the house building industry.
Why can't we have the same for house building? Say that we all understand there's a housing crisis and we all understand there's a need for housing. Yes. So let's have that starting point that all housing is good. And that's where the underlying messaging is fascinating in that sense.
And I think just we're already seeing the effect on clients in the renewable sector being able to sort of dust down sites where they may have had sort of options, contracts, they may have been on the sort of list in the past, and perhaps landscape visual impacts were felt to be just too difficult to overcome under previous policy. Those sites are being able to be looked at again, and it will provide many more opportunities for development to come forward.
And we're not all going to see turbines getting taller and taller and taller and taller. Mm-hmm. That seemed to be...
Well, from a generation point of view, the higher you go, the greater the generation. So if you can justify the landscape and visual impact, then yes. But the interesting thing, Karen was talking about clients dusting things down and looking to take advantage of the opportunities. George and myself are acting for a wind farm developer on an appeal, and we're just having a look at the response we've got. And the local authority are not really grasping what NPF4 shows as the direction of travel. They are still trying to justify an SPP style approach. And we're going to have to shove policy one back at them and say, policy one is the starting point. You've got the tone completely wrong. So I fear that is the danger that, as we've always found with changes of policy, it is going to take a while for it to settle down, and there will be some people in the planning world who will be slow to adapt, and that will be frustrating because we're going to keep having to remind them, you're not on message here, get yourself on message.
Yeah. And I think it's that first sort of wave of decisions coming through, particularly from the DPA or from the Energy Consents Unit, that are going to sort of set the tone for that going forward, and hopefully give the template for how those policies will be being applied from here on in. So it's definitely I think a good news story for the renewables industry.
Grand. So we've done housing, we've done renewables. Karen, I'll give you everything else. All other sectors. What kind of key policy changes, crossovers, what are your thoughts?
So make me think of that movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once. I think in some cases, or for some sectors, it's significant to know what's not there, in as much as what actually is there. And one of the things that I've been looking at and thinking about is the situation with student accommodation, and we've had many examples over recent years with projects hitting difficulties in our city centres. And it's disappointing not to see more, I think, direction on that in NPF4. With the extreme situations that we've been having, students not being able to take up their places for want of suitable accommodation. And I think the same might be said of some of the other sort of alternative residential uses, non-mainstream uses such as BTR or co-living. And BTR is over time is becoming a more familiar product for planning authorities to be dealing with. But generally, clients are having difficulties in these areas. Now, Housing Policy 16 does mention the need for choice, obviously, as you would expect, and provision for diverse needs. So there is a recognition there of student accommodation, and that build-to-rent products can contribute to the requirement. But it's very much a might contribute rather than a stronger policy statement, which I think the industry might have benefited from. I think in terms of policy more generally, with application across a range of sectors, biodiversity policy 3 is one which keeps coming up. It's probably worth a mention. Now, that's a policy that has a number of strands to it, as do many of the policies in NPF4, so applies across different scales of development, EIA development, slightly different tests and text, depending what bracket you fall into. Although interestingly, a carve out for aquaculture development, which is something that I'm interested in. But the requirement basically is for all development to be enhancing biodiversity or to include measures to contribute to that. Now, for some sectors or development types, and again, going back to our wind farms, for example, that's very much, the order of the day for those sorts of developers. And there's probably an easier opportunity for them to be doing that, whether it's, through sort of habitat enhancement measures, etc. But it doesn't apply quite so easily across the board. And if we're thinking of, again, going back to our city centres, office blocks, different sorts of urban development, it's not clear what the expectation will be or ultimately how that will play out. And I suppose one possibility is that it's coming down to a financial contribution at the end of the day, and that we'll see planning authorities setting up yet more funds to be collecting in contributions. So there'll be the usual open space, and maybe it's an add-on to that. But will that comply with the LSIC test in all cases? I think that would be something to be looked at.
Or you're moving towards the levy anyway, which will give, taking the levy and that
slowly,
yes. The sunset clause will be coming into force. You could have more green walls. We could maybe see more, I suppose, greening of the kind of developments, just in your terms of your city centre,
Certainly.
And your BTR, I was on a Scottish Housing with Care Task Force discussion earlier in the week, and we're talking about multi-generational developments in the city centre and, build to rent for older people. It's an interesting kind of change. So again, we've got, now a focus on, accommodation, for older people as well. So again, you might see the different models kind of coming in. And, it's fascinating when you see the bit about it would be students. It would be older people and having, kind of communal, it would be a nursery, it would be a cafe, and really would bring back to life and bring back that kind of footfall, in city centres if you were to be encouraging, that kind of development. It's obviously got to be of scale, kind of probably.
I'm just got a couple of questions on the biodiversity policy, so thought I'd just flag them now. So one is because there's currently no targets on what gain would be, and at the moment there's no guidance. That's expected autumn 2023. So the first question was linked to that. How, on that basis, if there's no measure of what biodiversity or what significant gain is that then down to the judgment? In which case, how is that kind of workable in the planning system? And also, at what time do you set the baseline? So, and for some projects such as lifetime extensions of, say, wind farm extensions and repowering, how can they produce a biodiversity net gain, or is it down to this just a judgment call from the planners in the context?
Yeah.
Well, Karen's thinking.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, in advance of the guidance, again, it's a bit of speculation. I think the difficulty is always trying to come up with something that covers every type of situation. There's always going to be some awkward ones where the important thing is to look back at, well, what is the overall objective here, and not maybe get so worried about the exact wording. It is going to be interesting, though, to see whether Scottish Government go down the English approach, where they've got what they call the DEFRA metric, and it's very numeric. I think there's always a slight concern that when you get it that systematized, do you actually lose sight of the overall objectives? You lose the flexibility. Does it become a bit of a monster? It's making me think of community infrastructure levy in England and Wales. Completely different topic. I'm sure Scottish Government are aware of those general themes, and they'll be taking them into account. And I think with all new approaches, there's going to be room for a bit of evolution and see how it goes. So again, it's avoiding being too prescriptive at the beginning, because if you're too prescriptive, you lose that opportunity for, whether it's innovation or evolution or actually both of them.
But again, is it anything new? It's that this bit about, sometimes I think we're guilty of, the NPF4 is a really scary document because it's all new, but we've all been having to kind of make sure that your site is increasing biodiversity and doing all of those things. Yeah. Anyway, it's back to my question about policy one. Is it anything really new, or is it just bringing to the fore the fact that you've got to be, improving the site, and that'll depend on the site to start with, kind of as well.
Yeah, and particularly where, obviously, the point we're making about policy 3 is that it applies across all scales. So you're not necessarily talking about EIA development where you're doing all that sort of detailed assessment work and may have, you're mining the sort of data in that way. So I would think it has to be proportionate to the development that you're dealing with, and I would be surprised if too scientific approach was taken to it in that respect.
And if it's not proportionate, you're going to end up just stopping development. And again, it's back to that bit. If we can remember that this is all about facilitating development and bringing it forward, but doing it in a way that is more sustainable, it's more, improving the biodiversity. That's what I like to think in my world. This is how it's going to happen.
Excellent, thanks. That's really helpful, and I liked the use of the term evolution on the biodiversity question, Neil, so well done. So 9 a.m. 13th of February, that's when NPF4 is coming in, D-Day if you want to call it. What can we expect between now and then? And then beyond that, I suppose, in terms of actual implementation of NPF4?
I think it's the S word that I've used already. And I'll pause for dramatic effect while everyone thinks, what was the nice word? Speculation and discussion and certain amount of disagreement, because that's just the way it's always been. The Minister reiterated when he was on our Planning Live that we will get transitional guidance. I think none of us will be surprised if it arrives very close to 9 o'clock on the 13th, possibly 5 o'clock on the Friday. And what that transitional guidance will cover and how detailed it will be, we'll just need to wait and see. Again, experience tends to suggest it won't go as far as we would like it to, but I've always felt it's human nature to want someone to tell us what to do, but it's also human nature to then get annoyed when you get told something that you don't actually quite like. So it's maybe no bad thing if the transitional guidance doesn't take us too far, because it gives us an element of flexibility to get to the right answer, as it were. And post 9 o'clock on the 13th, it's just the bedding down of, as each practical situation comes along, grappling with, well, what does NPF4 say? I think one of the biggest problems, and we've kind of touched on it in passing, is there's quite a few different bits to the NPF, and you've got to take it as a whole, and you've got to mesh it together for the particular thing you're looking at, and then say, well, as a whole, what does it tell us? And that's where the significant weight in policy 1 and some of the other policies becomes quite important. So it will take us a while to get used to actually what are the broad thrusts in specific situations. And in terms of what will be happening, perhaps the biggest thing will be the preparation of the new LDPs that a lot of planning authorities understandably have been holding off, knowing that NPF is going to be coming along. So they will presumably now be sharpening their metaphorical pencils and getting on with it, because they now know what it says. And again, the Minister trailed, we will be getting the procedural regulations for preparation of new LDPs. That'll tell us about how the gate check procedure will work. That's going to be extremely interesting now that we can see what NPF requires to be addressed. So what the gate check will address will be equally very interesting. So that's kind of going to be the main focus going forward on that. Well, what will the new LDPs actually look like? Because NPF makes it clear ministers would actually quite like just a kind of proposals map that says NPF sets all the policies, here are our allocations to deal with the policies. But it does say it can be appropriate for a local authority to take a slightly different approach. Of course, doesn't go into, well, what will the evidence base have to be for that? But certainly discussions we've been having, some local authority areas have always had some slightly different policies which are very appropriate in their area. It tends to be the more rural areas where perhaps there's scope for a slightly different approach on housing, a crofting style thing or something like that. So again, it's going to be interesting once people start to grapple with, well, how is the NPF going to allow us to take our LDP forward? Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to the kind of regs on the LDP and the gate, because I sat on the evidence report and gate check workshop with Scottish Government, and it had all the statutory, kind of undertakers, and it had reporters, and it was interesting because it's, having the evidence and compiling an evidence report without doing an LDP examination. And that discussion about how much information do you need, because, if you're trying to identify what infrastructure, because bear in mind, this is infrastructure led, deliver more housing, deliver more development, you've got the infrastructure at the same time. And yet, obviously, you then need to know, where's the development going to be? So, but I haven't decided where the development, because that's for the LDP. This is more about the strategy. And this is more about, have I got all the background information I need to be able to put the LDP, kind of together. In terms of your point about the kind of transition, I think it's been really interesting following the decisions that have been coming out of the, DPA, in terms of watching NPF4. We were all asked if we had kind of appeals, when it came out, what do you think? And very little weight was attached to it. So, there's an appeal decision out this morning for housing in Kilmacombe, and it's a material consideration, and they start to look at the policies and very much kind of comparing to, well, actually the LDP policies and the NPF4 policies are pretty similar. So, it's kind of been interesting. And that certainly,
I've started using NPF4 because you've got things that are in the system, applications that will be determined post the 13th. So, I've just put in an objection letter to something, and I've had to effectively measure it against NPF4. But again, a lot of the stuff is in the LDP. It's not kind of new from that point of view.
Mm-hmm. Grand. So we've got about 10 minutes left. So a couple of questions, hopefully. So from a planning authority's perspective, does NPF4 free up planners or to deal with local issues, or does it potentially shackle them?
I was asked that at a conference kind of last week, and my first kind of reaction is probably the same answer, is that immediately it's going to slow things down, just as we try and find our way through it and what does it mean and how do we go about it. But just the point that you made, Neil, the whole point of having NPF4 in a national policy is to stop the local authorities having to effectively kind of reinvent the wheel again at local authority level. So there should be less time surely spent on development plans and putting LDPs together if you don't need to repeat those policies. And you're going to have to ask for permission effectively and justify why you have to have a green belt policy when we have a perfectly good one, in NPF4. So I'd hope that would then give more time for the local issues for development management, perhaps, rather than arguing over the kind of policies. So I'm taking a positive look, and that, in due course, we'll all wonder what the fuss was about NPF4, and actually it will be good.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be counterintuitive to the development planners who've spent all those years working on those policies, but obviously that's the theory of it. And I suppose question also with supplementary planning guidance going, are we well indeed, but are we going to see something coming forward, which will put a further gloss on things which may or may not align entirely with the policies that are in NPF. Obviously, we're back to perhaps what used to happen in the days before statutory supplementary guidance, when you were then into a debate about how that had gone through a process, if indeed it had gone through any process, and how much weight it would then be attached to it.
But I quite like going back to that position, because I felt with the statutory supplementary guidance, because you didn't get it, it wasn't subject to an examination in the same way as the LDP policies, and yet it became part of the LDP and carried statutory weight. Whereas it goes back to material consideration, and as you say, we have that discussion about
make that
what
case.
consultation, and then the weight to be attached to it, kind of is probably less.
And of course, we had cases where the Scottish ministers had to step in and ask for the guidance not to be adopted because of the lack of proper consultation. So we shall see what comes forward, if anything, on that front.
That's really helpful. On perhaps more the development management side, Elaine, you already mentioned kind of how you've submitted an objection and some appeals are dealing with NPF4, but what are the implications for current and also future applications and appeals?
Well, as we've been saying, obviously, it's very much NPF4 now has to be taken into the mix, whether that's looking to the longer term. And I know, think of, for example, the situation in Glasgow with affordable housing, which we've mentioned before. Applicants are having to sort of project into the future to imagine where that all might get to, and sort of almost like nail their colours to the mast now if they're thinking of coming in with new proposals. Mentioned the transitional guidance and how that will play out, but I suppose there's a question of people thinking of the fairness of some of this, where they may have had applications that were prepared on a totally different basis, that have taken their time to work through the system, and now here they are sort of hitting the point of decision when NPF4 has come into play. I think an argument of fairness probably isn't going to get you too far in terms of any planning assessment if you're trying to sort of make that argument to a council or a reporter. I mean, new policy always emerges over time. It's not a case that it's not there one day and it's there the next. And usually you have a reasonable amount of notice as to the direction of travel. I think one of the particular difficulties here is because of the fairly significant changes that have emerged, in the final iteration of NPF4, where some of that may have been unexpected. But and I mean, we've had this sort of thing in the past to an extent, and, viability arguments have been used to try to sort of mitigate the effects of policy on things like affordable housing, where an application may have been prepared under one policy regime, or perhaps even land contracts entered into assuming a certain financial position. But, it may be more difficult to, I think, mitigate some of the effects of NPF4 in that sort of way.
I think, because you're right. There's always been that rolling position, isn't there, that you get a new LDP that comes in or a new SDP, or, as your application, because some applications can take quite a lot of time to go through the system, and it gets, kind of reassessed. I agree with you. It's where it brings in something that is going to increase the costs, the construction costs, the change or paying for infrastructure. A lot, again, I'd like to say is that a lot of the policies probably aren't that different, but it is those ones where you introduce something, heaven forbid your application has been in for, however many months, and then you get asked for another assessment. And, it pushes it back, because again, back to this, it should be about facilitating development and making sure development, kind of happens, As you can tell, I'm one of life's optimists. Assuming that this is all going to go along quite swimmingly.
But I think it's one thing on the financial side of things where you may be trying to perhaps resist a particular contribution or whatever, but for a far different situation where the application is in for an unallocated housing site and all the work's been done, all the investment has been made, you're simply going to have to put your best foot forward there.
And it is probably the housing one
under the material considerations.
Yeah, but the housing one, that with the question that came in, what's happening in this interim 3-4, years period until you've got the LDPs that actually take, policy 16 and implement them and allocate sufficient land for the kind of 10 years and have the wide choice of, kind of living. So yeah, there is going to be, that's probably one of the. You're all right on your renewables, and I'm having a tough time.
I'm going to have to jump in there because we've only got 1 minute left now. I suppose, quickly, because we had the question in, you have one word. Do you think, what are the key barriers holding Scotland back from achieving NPF4? That was a question that came in. So just one thing from each of you before we wrap up.
I think it's got to be the R word, hasn't it? In terms of resources, which was one of the things that was mentioned with the minister last week.
I would add confidence. I think experience over the last few years shows that a lot of planning officers in the public sector, the confidence isn't there to back things, push them through. It is now seems to be much more about bulletproofing from objectors, worrying about JR risk, which, as we know, is still a bit of a rarity. So I think a bit of confidence to get behind NPF4 and say, well, that's what Scottish Government want to happen. Let's make it happen.
I have a poster on my gym door at home that says, it's from my golf, that everything you need is already inside you. So I'd be saying we have everything that we need. And I like the fact it talks about being bold and it talks about being ambitious. And it is a bit about, subject to obviously the resources, about actually just getting in and getting after it and remembering why we're here is to facilitate more development, is to provide more housing, and let's get on and let's get after it.
Finish on a positive note.
Yeah, thank you very much, all three of you. That was, really interesting. Some really good questions, and if we didn't get to answering your questions, we'll get in touch because there were some we didn't get. We got one in 7 minutes, or two in 7 minutes. I think that might be a PB for Planning Live. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Sorry we overran by a minute, but there was a lot to cover. So I'm impressed that we managed to get so much done. So thank you very much for joining everyone. Cheers.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.